Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd, coming to you from my yard in beautiful Los Angeles, California. Today we are having a very windy day, and that may cause some interruption during this critter chat, but we will see how it goes. I'm kind of tucked away in a corner of my yard where I'm getting a little protection from my house as a windbreak, so hopefully that helps out. Today is a very special day. It is World Oceans Day. World Oceans Day was created by a group of people who wanted to try to raise awareness and make some laws, protections, and other things to help protect the oceans of the world. Initially, when it was created, it was called World Ocean Day to emphasize that all oceans are connected. It's really one ocean. We just call it different names. So we call it the Pacific Ocean here by me in California. We call it the Atlantic Ocean on the other side of the country by like Florida and New York. On the other side of the world, we have the Indian Ocean between Africa and Asia and south of India. And then of course we have what we call the Arctic Ocean at the north portion of the globe, kind of above where most of the land ends. Above Alaska, above Canada, and above Russia, Norway, and Finland. It's all connected. It's all one big body of water. It's all one ocean. But today in our Critter Chat on World Oceans Day, we're going to talk about a very unique and special animal. If you saw the photos earlier, we're talking about a fish today, but it's not just any fish. It is a giant sea bass. I had the opportunity to work in and around areas with giant sea bass during my time that I was employed at the Aquarium of the Pacific, and I really learned a lot about them and really learned to love them as a species and appreciate just how incredible they are. These giant fish live off the coast of California and Baja, Mexico. That's the only place in the world they are. Literally just south of the Oregon-California line is about as far north as you will see them out in the ocean, and they're usually pretty close to the coast, typically seen in water that is less than 200 feet deep. They sometimes go to deeper water, but it's not very often. They live fairly close to the shoreline in pretty shallow waters. They live all the way down the coast of California and down that coastal portion of Mexico, that little dangly part of Mexico that kind of is separated from mainland called Baja California or Baja Mexico. And then they live on the other side of that up into what is called the Gulf of California, or sometimes called the Sea of Cortez, which is all connected to the ocean, but is a little more protected from big waves and stuff, just because it's a little more surrounded by land. These giant fish can get absolutely huge. They are very large, they're very slow moving, and they're very curious animals. Typically, like I said, they live in water that's not that deep, and they spend most of their time close to the coast because their preferred habitat is something called the kelp forest. Kelp is giant seaweed. It's huge. It also grows in water that's about that same depth. So typically in water that is less than 150 feet deep, around that to maybe like 20 feet deep. And it grows so fast. It's actually one of the fastest growing organisms on the planet. Kelp is actually an algae, not a plant. It doesn't have roots that go into the ground to collect nutrients. It gathers the nutrients from around it, like other algae do. But giant kelp can grow 18 inches a day. And because of that, it often grows taller than the water that it's in. So it floats up on the surface, creating this thing, it's very similar to like a rainforest, where the trees grow so tall and create this big canopy that kind of covers everything, and really creates a very protected ecosystem out there in the ocean. That's very important for the giant sea bass. And in the kelp forest, they are the top of the food chain. Occasionally, some sharks will come into that area, and some big sharks like great white sharks will occasionally eat giant sea bass. but it's pretty rare, to be honest. They don't really have very many predators. Giant sea bass, like I said, are huge. Oh, and the kelp forest. It's such a great ecosystem that it's second only to coral reefs as far as ocean ecosystems go, as far as the diversity out there in the ocean. So kelp forests are very, very diverse. Lots of different species live in a kelp forest, and kelp forests are very important to the health of the ocean and many of the species that rely on it. Kelp forests also only exist in a handful of places around the world. Aside from off the coast of California and Mexico, they can be found off the coast of South America along Chile and Argentina, and in places around Australia and New Zealand. And that's kind of it. Pretty rare, beautiful areas in the ocean. But the giant sea bass only lives in the kelp forest off of California and Mexico. Sorry, the wind's blowing my notes around a little bit today. Oh, the largest giant sea bass ever recorded was one that was caught and actually weighed and measured back in the 60s. That individual fish was 7 feet 4 inches in length, absolutely huge, and weighed in at 563.5 pounds. So absolutely huge. Now that's the biggest one that's ever been officially measured. There are many reports from divers that some may be bigger out there, although those reports are fairly old because giant sea bass don't get that big anymore. And it's kind of a long, sad story, but we'll talk a little bit about that during today's Critter Chat. So let's start by talking about these fish are very slow growing. So even though they get huge, it takes them a long time to get to that size. They can also live into their 70s. They continue to grow throughout their lives. So the biggest fish are most likely the oldest fish. Because they're slow growing, they usually have to be about 15 to 20 years old before they can reproduce, before they can have babies on their own. And once they get to that age or that size, they are usually about 3 feet in length and probably close to 200 pounds, maybe about 100 pounds at 3 feet. But they live in the coastal areas. They even come into further shallow waters for their spawning. So that's the time when they're ready to reproduce. That typically happens between May and September. That's when the ocean temperatures are the warmest in that area of California to Mexico. And they'll come into water sometimes as shallow as like 20 feet deep and spawn. Spawn is a way of reproducing that is common in a lot of fish. What that is the male actually nudges the female fish, and then she will release eggs out of her body into the ocean, and then he will fertilize them. They are not eggs like chicken eggs, so they have a very soft, permeable outer covering. So he's able to fertilize them after they've been laid. And then once those eggs are fertilized, they become buoyant. So they float up to the top of the surface, and they usually hide in that top layer of kelp that's kind of floating along the surface. And they will stay there for about 24 to 36 hours. So a day and a half after they're fertilized. And they will float up there, and then they'll hatch and become what scientists are calling larva stage fish. So they're itty bitty tiny things that we can barely even kind of figure out what it is when we see them. During the spawning season, a female giant sea bass may lay as many as 60 million eggs, which is incredible. That's a ton of little eggs. They're just itty bitty things like this from a big fish. And obviously not all of them are going to be fertilized. Not all of them are going to hatch that are fertilized, and not all of them that hatch are going to survive. The ocean is a big place, and there's lots of hungry animals that are willing to eat anything that is smaller than they are, and that will include baby fish like the baby giant sea bass. After they hatch, they will stay in kind of that top layer of the water for about a month. During that time, they're going to eat plankton. Plankton is, of course, the smallest plants and animals that live in the ocean, and they're just itty bitty. We can barely see them without a microscope. Some of those are going to be little tiny animals, some of those are little tiny plants, some of those are babies of other animals that get big. So the baby giant sea bass kind of live up at the surface level for about a month. And then once they grow to a big enough size, they start to get a little more, their equilibrium balances out, and they can start to descend or go a little lower in the water column. And then they'll go hide in the kelp as it's growing a little closer to the bottom. And once that happens, they'll grow to about the size of a silver dollar, so about that big around. And they usually at that stage develop very bright colors, typically like yellows, oranges, and almost some reds with some little spots. That looks very different than the adults. For a long time, scientists recognized those little babies as a different species than what the adults were, because they look so different. They're a different shape, they're a different color, but they do live in the same habitat. It took them a while to figure out that these little bright colored fish are actually babies of these giant kind of silvery with spots fish. Once they're kind of that bright colored fish, they typically hide really close to the kelp so that they can try to be a little safe. They will eat small other fish, plankton, and little other things floating in and around the water where they live. During that time, they're going to slowly start to grow, and once they get about 8 inches long, they're going to start to change to the darker color similar to the adults. So then they kind of get a silvery color with the big black spots. They have the spots when they're bright colors too, and those black spots just kind of get bigger and kind of stay with them throughout their life, although the adults can kind of make their spots be more prominent or make their spots be a little more dull. They have some unique abilities to kind of enhance the coloration of their skin, including their spots. Let's see. Yeah, so once they get to be about 8 inches, they start to develop those adult colorations. During my time working at the Aquarium of the Pacific, they had a baby or a juvenile black sea bass or giant sea bass. They're also called black sea bass. That fish is named Yutaka. Yutaka is the first baby giant sea bass to successfully be born at a public aquarium. Yutaka was born in 2016. So Yutaka is almost 4 years old now. And Yutaka, last I saw, which was in March, Yutaka was about this big. His body, his or hers, we usually call him a him, but we don't know for sure, was a little bit bigger than a football. At about 3.5 years old, Yutaka was about that size, but still very slow growing. But Yutaka looked quite a bit like Yutaka's parents did as far as coloration goes. Nice black spots, kind of a silvery skin otherwise. So once they get to kind of that size, their way of food eating gets a little better developed, and especially as they get to be huge like the parent fish, the way they eat is they just open their really big mouth, and that kind of creates an underwater vacuum, and it just sucks in whatever's around them. That enables them to eat fish without actually like swimming real fast to catch them. And they can usually kind of hide in some shadows or under the dark cover of some of the kelp and kind of just wait till something else swims by and then open their mouth really quickly, and it just sucks the water and the close by fish in. So they are very good ambush predators, kind of waiting for their prey to come to them. With that, they're very slow moving themselves. And because they don't have a lot of predators, they actually are quite curious, and often when divers are exploring the kelp forest, black sea bass or giant sea bass will often come up to the divers to kind of figure out who and what these things are. They don't really hurt people, they don't try to chase them away, they don't try to scare them away, but they do get very curious and they come very close. Now that actually became a big problem for the giant sea bass, because as it turns out, giant sea bass are delicious. And that was learned fairly early on by humans, and by the early 1800s, people started to fish for the giant sea bass on a commercial level. That means boats were trying to deliberately catch as many of these fish as they can to sell them for people to eat. They started doing that in the 1800s. They had their best year ever of catching giant sea bass in 1932. After 1932, they started to catch less and less and less each year. And that's because the population was starting to decline, although that wasn't realized right away. After a while, commercial fishing for giant sea bass kind of stopped, or definitely slowed down, because it wasn't as profitable. It wasn't worth as much money, because you weren't catching as many as you used to be able to. During that time, recreational fishing for giant sea bass increased. More people said, oh, I used to be able to buy this at the market, but now they don't have it as often. But I know where I can go and catch some myself, and I'm gonna go catch some for my family for a big party, and we're gonna have a big fish fry. And so that became very popular, especially as people started to dive a little more in the ocean, and scuba gear became a little more technically advanced. Specifically in the 50s and 60s and 70s, recreational fishing for giant sea bass really took off. Especially with a diver, they didn't even have to be very skilled. They could just have a spear, and they would go under the water, and when the giant sea bass would come up to them, they could just catch it with a spear and easily catch dinner that could feed a lot of people, because these are huge fish. And during that time, as recreational fishing for the giant sea bass really took hold, the best year in California for doing that was 1963. That was the year that recreational fishers caught the most number of any year in California. Similarly, in Mexico, that happened 10 years later in 1973. After both those years, 63 in California, 73 in Mexico, population started to decline. There were less fish out there, less people were able to catch less fish as frequently. And during that time, people in California realized that because these fish were disappearing, that there weren't nearly as many of them, there was a local fishing ban put in place for the first time in California in 1981. That ban started to do some good, but there were still people trying to fish illegally for them, or fishing just outside the jurisdicted protected area for them. In 1988, California made it a statewide ban against commercial or recreational fishing for giant sea bass in any California waters. Unfortunately, that meant that it was still legal to fish for them in Mexico, and Mexico finally caught on and put a ban in place in the 90s. In 1990, California also outlawed coastal gill nets. These are big nets that are used to catch a variety of fish fairly close to the California coast, and although the giant sea bass were protected, many of them were still getting caught in these big nets used to catch other fish, and that's called bycatch. When you catch something you're not necessarily trying to catch, but it still gets caught in the net. So a ban on coastal gill nets put in place in 1990, and that kind of helped further improve opportunity for the giant sea bass. Now, as we talked about earlier, they grow really slow, and they have to be about 15 or 20 years before they can have babies on their own. Because of all this extreme fishing that happened during like the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, before those bans were really fully activated, there weren't many adult fish out there. There weren't many giant sea bass at all. And people honestly wondered if we had eaten this fish to extinction. Luckily, there were still some out there, and in recent years, divers have started to see more and more, and they're starting to see some of the bigger ones again. So they survived, but they were little and growing all those many years. Now they are listed as critically endangered. We don't know how many are out there because the ocean is a big place and it's hard to get a good population census of any animal in the ocean. It's a tricky thing to try to monitor, but they kind of do estimations based on, like, they send divers, scientists, researchers to try to count how many they see in this area at this time, and then they kind of map that out and do an educated guess as to how many may be out there, but we really don't know. They do know that in recent years more and more are being seen, which is some good news. Unfortunately, there are still a lot of threats facing the giant sea bass. So the biggest threat they've ever faced was people like to eat them, and people like to catch them. They're a big fish, so some people like to catch them just for the fun of it. If they catch one today, it is still illegal to keep that fish. You are supposed to take it off your hook and release it back into the ocean. There has been a lot of scientific research being done to try to figure out where they go, how they live, how long before they can actually reproduce. All of those things are still just kind of educated guesses. With the ocean, it's difficult to do good research because it's hard to keep track of animals. They are specifically tagging some giant sea bass now to where they can track the locations and movements of certain individuals. With that, they found that there's 4 that are tagged that migrate seasonally. They move about 50 miles different times of the year. So during their spawning season and during the winter time, they move about 50 miles between 2 different locations during that time frame. So they're still trying to figure out where they always go and when they go. There's still a lot to learn from a scientific standpoint. Because they're critically endangered, they still face a lot of threats, but there's ways that we can all help out. So things that giant sea bass really need is, 1, a healthy ecosystem. That is provided by something that the US government implemented a few years back called a marine protected area. It's sometimes abbreviated to be an MPA, Marine Protected Area. That's similar to like a national forest or kind of like a state or national park. That's a place where there's a lot of regulations in place, specifically no fishing. You can't anchor a boat in that area. You can go to that space, you can visit it, but you can't anchor. You can't do anything that would keep you there too long. You can't catch any fish. You're not supposed to do anything that could hurt the environment. Definitely things like pollution and litter and all of those things come into play for marine protected areas and the surrounding areas. Now that's also a little difficult because it's the ocean and things kind of move in and out with currents all the time. There are some marine protected areas specifically around some of the islands, the Channel Islands off the coast of California, and specifically off of Catalina. There's some marine protected areas that are really helping to protect the kelp forest where the giant sea bass live. Now the kelp forest also can be threatened by a lot of things. 1, it struggles if there's a lot of chemicals or pollution in the water. We've learned that in recent years when there's been a lot of rain on the in southern and central California. It washes a lot of pollution from the cities into the rivers and into the rivers into the ocean. Those chemicals can cause a lot of problems with the water quality out in the coastal ocean areas and can really negatively affect the kelp forest. Another thing that really affects the kelp forest in a negative way is warming ocean temperatures. In 2015 and 2016, we had a weather situation called an El Nino that causes a big warm area of water to kind of move further north out of Mexico into California. And during that time, a lot of the kelp forest in California started to die. And many of the animals that rely on the kelp forest also started to die. With that, also some of the tropical animal species that are typically seen down in Mexico started to come further north, and things like sea snakes were seen in Southern California for the first time in many, many years. Also, some tropical species of fish made it all the way up to Monterey, California, because of this big bubble of warm water that came up into California during that time. One way we can all help out with ocean temperatures is the energy we consume. Specifically, anything that is a fossil fuel like coal, natural gas, oil, gasoline. All of those add to the carbon monoxide and greenhouse gases in our air, and that causes kind of a blanket that warms the entire planet, but it specifically affects the oceans and causes the ocean temperatures to rise. And when temperatures rise in the ocean, it causes all sorts of problems like for kelp forests, but also areas around the world like coral reefs struggle with warmer temperatures. We also talked about that a bit in the Critter Chat about sea turtles and how warm temperatures in the oceans and in the shoreline areas of oceans have caused a big imbalance in males versus females in sea turtles. Go back and watch that episode if you don't know what I'm talking about. That was an early episode in the Critter Chats, which you can find on YouTube or at jeremythezoonerd.com. More research needs to be done about giant sea bass. We're still trying to learn a lot of things, where they go, when they go there, the different areas that are very important for them for their spawning grounds, and how to really protect those areas that are so close to our coastline where people use the ocean a lot, how we can all work together to make that a safe place. Now, there's also some really great things that are happening. There's been a lot of research that the Aquarium of the Pacific, where I worked previously, has been involved in a lot of research about giant sea bass. With Yutaka, who is the giant sea bass born at the aquarium 3.5 years ago, they've been studying that fish as it's grown. They tried to figure out what kind of temperatures and water quality and food that fish really needed to survive and thrive. With that, they shared that information with other aquariums who also have giant sea bass. And this past summer, Cal State Northridge, a university, was able to have a lot of baby giant sea bass. I think they had near 300 babies born, and they were able to share those with a couple other aquariums so that multiple aquariums could raise them to help more of those babies survive. And in doing so, they helped get them up to a bigger size, and then they've actually gone out and released them back into the ocean in some of those marine protected areas and areas where they feel that giant sea bass can survive, where there's a lot of protection and a safe habitat for them to do so. I'll be sharing an article that talks a little bit about that release that's really incredible. I believe that happened earlier in March or April. No, it was for sure March, because I was still working at the aquarium before the coronavirus shutdown happened there. But it's a really great story and a really big success for the science and conservation efforts of many different aquariums and partners that have been involved in helping to help out the giant sea bass. And with that, our special shout out today is my former employer, the Aquarium of the Pacific, who has done a lot of great work in helping people learn about giant sea bass, and also done some science work on the backside behind the scenes to learn more about how to help protect that species. In addition to all of that, with today being World Ocean Day, I want to talk about something that's not related to giant sea bass, but could really use our help today. There is a place in the Atlantic Ocean, about 100 miles off the coast of Cape Cod in Massachusetts. And it is called the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument. So this is like a national park out in the ocean. And it was set up in 2015, 2016 by then President Barack Obama. It was put in place as a sanctuary for very endangered whales, dolphins, turtles, deep sea corals, and 10 species of sharks that live in the Atlantic Ocean. This is kind of a safe place where there's not to be any fishing and to be very limited recreation areas, so that people don't mess up the ocean in this very important breeding ground and very important habitat in the Atlantic Ocean. It's the only national marine monument in the Atlantic Ocean in US waters, so it's a very special place. Our current federal administration is trying to change that. They're trying to take away the protections of that area. They're trying to reopen that area for fishing. They're trying to dismantle some of the protections that that area faces. And I would encourage all of the people who follow me on ZooNerd to take some action. So there is a petition that has been created by the New England Aquarium. They're an aquarium located in Boston, or the surrounding areas of Boston. They helped create that national marine monument. They were instrumental in it being protected in the first place. And they're very much trying to help fight to keep it surviving, to help keep those protections in place. I'll be posting a link to their petition, and I would ask that you read through it, and if it is something you feel comfortable doing, that you sign that petition to help let our elected officials know that we care about the ocean and that we care about protecting the ocean and the ocean animals who live in those areas. I'll be putting those links up later today on the ZooNerd Facebook profile, so check them out there. What else do I have today? So that's our important action item. I don't ask for you to be that involved politically very often, so please take a good look at this. Sorry, my neighbor's out having some fun. Also, feel free to like, follow, subscribe, and share any of my information on my ZooNerd platforms. You can find all of the Critter Chats live on YouTube. I upload them daily on Facebook and Instagram, and also on my website at jeremythezoonerd.com. This week, we're going to be celebrating World Oceans Day all week long, so tune in tomorrow for another Critter Chat about another ocean critter. And have fun, be happy, be safe. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.